pain's a part of life.
I think some people believe it's a test of your faith, but if you don't have a faith to believe in, it kind of makes you wonder why is there suffering in this world?
It was a reason why he took him. Maybe he needed some angels up there to protect, to help him in the fight against the devil.
A baby is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Why doesn't he want me to have this?
Bad things are just the way that you see them.
I think God's in everything we do.
Why would anybody want to create people who do horrible things to each other? It doesn't make any sense.
I don't think God's sitting there and saying these people are hurting and maybe I should help them.
I suppose the answers will come. It's just I'm going through a journey right now that's painful.
Well, welcome to week 3 of our series, Explore God, where we've been joining with hundreds of churches throughout the San Francisco Bay Area and talking about 7 big questions that kind of explore God, faith, and purpose. One of the things that we've said from the beginning is that our goal in this series is not to try to convince you of anything. It's not to try to send you off with pat answers that never really resolve anything about practical life. But rather, the goal of this series is for us to join together and explore these 7 big questions. And today's big question is one that I think really connects with a lot of people. And it's simply this: why does God allow pain and suffering? Why does he allow pain and suffering in our lives? And I think this question is one of the most human questions that we can have. Because as humans, we feel it. We experience the pain and suffering. And you can't turn on the news or turn on social media and not see the pain and suffering that's going on in the world. The wars, the starvation, the slavery, the genocide, the natural disasters, all happening around us. And for a lot of people, for a lot of us, we've seen it in our own lives. We've seen it in the lives of the people we love. We've seen it at our schools and in our jobs. We've seen it in our finances, in our relationships, in our marriages. And it's one of those questions that even the strongest, the most faithful Christians have still asked. Why, God? Why? For some, answering this question has actually been kind of a spiritual journey. And for others, this question makes them conclude that they don't want to have anything to do with any kind of God that would allow that kind of pain and suffering to enter into the world, or to come to me, or to come to the people that I love. So today what we're going to do is we're going to explore God by listening to the words of Jesus himself. You know, one of the interesting things about Jesus is that Jesus often taught using parables. He taught using stories that used physical elements to convey spiritual truth. Because not only did Jesus welcome and encourage the hard questions, he wanted us to ask the hard questions, but he also wanted to challenge the way the people think, the way you and I think, the way we all think about God. And so Jesus uses these stories, these parables to teach, and they aren't just cute little stories, they're earthly stories with heavenly meanings. And for many people like me, reading through these stories have changed the way that we think about God, have changed the way that we operate in the world, the way we act, the way we treat people, even the way that we treat ourselves. And that's how good stories work, isn't it? I mean, a good story changes the way we think and changes what we do. I remember the first time that I saw the movie Jaws. And it changed the way I thought and changed the way I behaved. Because the next time I went to a beach, man, I was looking around all over the place to make sure that nothing was going to happen to me. The experience of that story changed how I function in the world. And that's what Jesus wants to do with these parables, to get us to think differently about the world. So we're going to look at a parable today. We're going to dive right in. It was a parable that Jesus told. It was recorded by a man named Matthew. Matthew was a friend of Jesus. He was one of Jesus' disciples, one of his students, one of his followers. And Matthew recorded the events of Jesus' ministry. And this is how Matthew writes or records what Jesus said. He says, here's another story Jesus told. This is Matthew writing this. And then this is Jesus speaking. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like. And you see, Jesus uses this phrase, the kingdom of heaven, but he's not talking about the heaven that a lot of times you and I talk about heaven, like heaven is up in the clouds somewhere. Heaven is, that place where you go, where after here, like if you hope that for the best, that's where you're going to end up. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, that's not what he's talking about. Jesus is talking about how life operates here in the world today. That's what he means. How does the world work when we make the decision to let God be the Lord and the ruler of our lives, and then how God manifests himself in our world and in our lives when we make that decision? And over again, Jesus would tell us that in the kingdom of heaven, the rules are different. They operate differently than they do in the world. And part of the reason that you and I can't grasp or have a difficulty grasping this whole concept of the kingdom of heaven is because you and I live outside of the culture that the people who Jesus was speaking to at the time lived. Because the people who were living inside the culture, to them, what Jesus was saying was extremely powerful. You see, the Jewish people had all these expectations about a day that would come. A day that would come when all of the brokenness of the world, where all of the pain, all of the tragedy, all of the sickness, the disease, all of the garbage that messes up our world, all the injustice, all the evil, all the darkness in the world, that to a Jewish person, one day God was going to show up and turn all of that around. They all had this expectation that he was going to bring about this renewal of the world. And when that would happen, sins would be forgiven, sins would go away, sickness would go away, pain would go away, suffering would go away. And the phrase they used to talk about what it would be like to live in that day was the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus comes onto the scene and says, listen, I'm bringing the kingdom. All the brokenness that you were waiting to be taken care of, all of the sin you were waiting to be dealt with, it's finally here. In fact, Jesus would often say that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. As close as your hand, it's right here. Jesus is saying, I'm bringing the kingdom. And if you understand what that means, what the people then would have understood was that this was a beautiful message of hope, not just for them, but for all of us. That whatever it is that has you weighed down, whatever sin that you so easily get tangled up in, whatever addiction has you in chains today, that when you are walking in the kingdom, all of that changes. And so Jesus is saying, listen, the kingdom of heaven, and he's about to tell them, the kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. But that night, as the workers slept, now there's something here that's happening, right? He's saying that it's a farmer and he's planted good seed in the field. So he's got a field, it's good. He's got seed, it's good. The farmer has done the work. But then he says, but that night, as the workers slept. Now there's something missing in the translation here. Because in this translation, it translates that phrase, workers slept, or the workers, to help us understand that this is who he was talking to. But in the Greek that this was written to, that phrase, the workers, is the Greek phrase ha anthropos, which means everyone. Now this is significant because everyone has weeds. All of us have weeds. Listen to why I'm talking about that. He says, but that night as the workers slept, his enemy came, the farmer's enemy, his enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat, then slipped away. When the crop began to grow and produce grain, the weeds also grew. So here's two things that Jesus is telling us. First, he's telling us that there is an enemy out there. There's an enemy that is planting the weeds. Someone is doing it. And the second thing he's saying is that the wheat and the weeds are growing together. They're growing at the same time. And I think this is especially important for us, but especially for those of you who live here in the Bay Area or live here in California, because here on the West Coast, our culture is very influenced by Eastern philosophy. And one of the things that I love about biblical Christianity is that it acknowledges that evil exists. It acknowledges that sin exists. It acknowledges that there is a real enemy out there, which in Judaism and in Christianity is Satan. That he's there. The Christianity says 100%, no doubt, there is evil in the world. But if you look at Buddhism or some forms of Hinduism, what they believe is that evil is not real, that it's an illusion. That when bad things happen to you, it's just an illusion. The biblical story, however, does not come to that conclusion. Jesus doesn't say that the bad things that happen to you aren't real. Jesus is saying, no, listen, they are real. That thing that's happening in your life is real. The cancer is real. The divorce is real. The death of a loved one is real. The business failing is real. Whatever it is that is in your life right now, Jesus is saying, yes, it's real. There are weeds in life. Bad things happen. But the beautiful part of biblical theology is that it says it's happening to you. It's happening to you. You can't pretend that it's not happening. A lot of people still do that. I've never met anybody personally, but I've heard of people who won't go visit a person who has cancer in the hospital because to go to the hospital would acknowledge that cancer exists. And Jesus is saying to us, listen, the weeds exist. The weeds in life exist, and something has to be done about them. Pretending it's not real, I don't know that it's going to get you to where you want to be, but it's only one of the ways that people deal with the weeds. The second way that people try to deal with the weeds, Jesus is going to tell us about. His parable goes on. He says, the farmer's workers went to him and said, "Sir, the field where you planted that good seed is full of weeds. Where did they come from?" In other words, I thought you raised your kids right. I thought you two were in love. I thought you planned everything out before you started that business. I thought you went to church every week. I thought you were a person who prayed and believed. What happened to all of that good seed? What happened to the good seed you planted? Where did all of these weeds come from? Jesus answers and he says, "An enemy has done this," the farmer explained. And then listen to what the other response to the weeds is. The first one was to pretend that it wasn't real, to say that it was an illusion. But here's the second one. The second response is this. "Should we pull out the weeds?" they asked, the people, the workers. Should we pull out the weeds? You see, these guys think that they know how to deal with the evil in the world. They think they know how to deal with the awfulness of the world. And isn't that what you and I do? Isn't that how we think? Haven't we ever been in a situation and thought to ourselves, man, if I was God, this is how I would solve that problem. I could solve that problem right now. Instead of asking God, we will tell God, hey, God, listen, I've got this idea. Right? God, you should do things differently. Well, God, what you need to do is just to gather all of the evil and just do this with it. And we say that because we think, I know what to do. And we do, right? I mean, that's what we think. Like when our life is falling apart and we think to ourselves, man, if I was God, this is how I would fix it. This is the things that I would do. We know the things that need to be done. And in fact, we're fine if God doesn't involve himself in it at all. Like, God, listen, it's cool. We can take care of it. Just do what we need you to do. I can handle it. I just need more energy. I just need more time. I will be able to figure it out. And listen, some of you who've been doing this, if we can be honest for a moment, you're just exhausted. You're exhausted from trying to fix your marriage, trying to fix your kids, trying to fix your money problems, trying to fix your sickness, trying to fix your mom, trying to fix your boss, trying to fix your neighbor. And the reason you're working at it is because you know better than God. I mean, that's what we think. And the one thing that we're not doing, that we're not admitting to God is, actually, I don't have a really good plan on how to deal with this. What I have is a theory, but I'm not sure it's going to work. And so why don't I just go over here and grab all of these weeds and yank them out? Listen to what Jesus says next. He says, "No," he replied. Don't just pull up the weeds. You will uproot the wheat if you do. In other words, he's saying you're going to take out, if you try to take out one, you're going to take out the other. He says, let both grow together until the harvest. We would never do that, right? Which is why we try to control things, because we don't want both to grow. Instead, what we do is we keep things to ourselves to try to solve them instead of taking them to God. We want to pull the weeds out. And God says, no, hold on. You've got to let them grow together. There was a children's book. I don't know if you've ever read it before, but it's called Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. And in the book, Alexander wakes up and he has gum in his hair. He gets into trouble for fighting with his brothers. He finds out that he has a cavity. For dinner, they have lima beans, and he's stuck wearing railroad pajamas to bed. I mean, he just has a terrible, horrible, no good, bad day. And so you know what Alexander's solution is? To move to Australia. That will solve the problem. Until his mom reminds him that, some days are just like that. Some days are bad days. Sometimes bad things happen, even in Australia. Bad things happen everywhere. And listen, if you're in that place right now, if you're in one of those bad day seasons right now, one of the things I want to assure you of is that you're not alone. You're not alone. There is story after story in the Bible and story after story all throughout history of people experiencing pain and suffering. I have my own stories of pain and suffering. In fact, if we took a poll of all of the people who are watching us online right now, who are watching us here live today, and asked who's experienced pain and suffering, I'll bet you the room is filled with them. We've all had those bad day seasons. And listen, if you're in one right now, you are not the first, and you won't be the last to go through it. To wonder, why does God allow pain and suffering? Where is God? If he's really there, where is he in all of this? And why? Why does he allow it? Why, God, why? In other words, why does both have to happen? Why does there have to be weeds and wheat? Why can't he just pull the weeds out right now? It's such a hard question. And part of the reason that it's such a hard question is because at its root, it's not an intellectual question. It's a personal question. And it hits us especially hard when we're talking about our own pain or the pain of someone that we love. So in the time that we have left, here is what we're not going to do. We're not going to try to solve the issue of pain and suffering. It's way more complicated than that. We're not going to minimize anyone's pain and suffering, your pain and suffering with simple platitudes like everything happens for a reason, or don't worry, all you have to do is pray about it. I'm not going to tell you that your situation will get better if you just have enough faith. That's not how God operates. Instead, what we're going to do is wrestle with this question together. And to do this, we're going to take a look at a guy named Habakkuk. I know it's kind of a weird name. Some of you may not ever heard that name before. Habakkuk was a 7th century BC prophet in Israel. He was a prophet right before just before the collapse and the destruction of the southern kingdom of Israel by the Babylonians. And in that time, the culture in Israel where Habakkuk was it was a time of injustice. It was a time of idolatry. It was a time where the prevalent dominant culture had disconnected from God. They were doing their own thing. But unlike other prophets in the past, Habakkuk doesn't stand up and call the people to repentance, to call the people to come back to God. Instead, Habakkuk stands up and he talks to God. The entire book of Habakkuk is an account of his personal struggle to believe that God is still good in spite of all of the pain and suffering in the world around him. And so his short book starts with these desperate words. Listen to what he says. How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. Violence is everywhere, I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. Sound familiar? I mean, it's like we're 2,700 years later, almost 2,800 years later, and we're still asking the same questions. God, why aren't you answering my prayers? God, why are you allowing all of this pain and suffering? Why don't you care about the pain that all of these people are going through, that I am going through? Why, God? See, these are hard and difficult questions to ask, and they're even harder in the day and time that we live in, I believe. But if we just take a step back for a minute, because yes, I know we want to get rid of pain and suffering. And I'm not saying that we don't have a duty to do our best to try to limit or eliminate pain and suffering in the world. But can we consider for a moment that there's something else going on here? That there is something deeper? Can we consider for a moment a few cultural lies that have permeated our thinking so much that it makes it even harder to deal with the pain and suffering that we are enduring in the world? The first lie that culture tells us is this, that the goal of life is to be happy. In other words, the goal of life is a life with no weeds. See, our culture sends us nonstop messages saying the ultimate goal of life is happiness and that we deserve to be happy. And so we are bombarded with these messages that a new car or a new phone or a new relationship or the next exotic vacation is all we need to get to that place of happiness. But see, I believe that believing that the goal of life is to be happy, believing that is dangerous. You know why? Because if the meaning of life is happiness, and then any pain or suffering that we experience destroys our life's meaning. If pain and suffering is the opposite of happiness, and the meaning of life is happiness, then all suffering has to be bad. That's the conclusion. But what if that's not the case? One of my favorite authors and theologians wrote this. He said, in the secular view, suffering is never seen as a meaningful part of life, but only as an interruption. The world doesn't see suffering as having any benefit. So is it any surprise that we have difficulty dealing with pain and suffering when we only see it as something that threatens our happiness? The second cultural lie that makes it hard for us to deal with pain and suffering is the lie that says, if I do good, I will be rewarded. If I do bad, I will be punished. That's karma, right? But karma infers that there is a level of fairness in life. Biblical Christianity never connects the morality of people to their pain and suffering. In fact, Jesus says specifically, you get both. the weeds and the wheat. When you are good, it doesn't mean that God is any more pleased with you than it does mean that when you are bad, that you're being punished. See, the thing is, you can check off all of the boxes on the list of things you think that will make God happy. You know, reading your Bible, praying, going to church, giving, serving at your church, serving other people. You can do all of those things, and it still doesn't guarantee that life won't be hard. You can do all of those things, and your car still might break down. You can do all of those things and your marriage still may fall apart. You can do all of those things and your kids still might get mixed up with the wrong crowd. We still might get sick. We still might wake up in the middle of the night with crippling anxiety. The Word of God is real with us, right? It says suffering is inevitable. No one escapes it. Everyone experiences it. Such great news. Aren't you glad that you are spending time with us today? Now listen, this seems like bad news, but then Jesus comes along. And while acknowledging the reality that we live in, he also reminds us of this truth. This is Jesus' words. He says, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. But take heart, because I have overcome the world. You see, karma says, you get what you deserve. Jesus says, listen, I know this is going to be hard, but don't worry. I got you. The third cultural lie I want to talk about today is the lie that says, I have to be okay right now. Because we want it and we want it right now. You know whose fault this is? Jeff Bezos. Because right now, I can have just about anything that I want delivered right to my front door just by clicking on a button that says buy or purchase or go, whatever it is that your app says. You click it and poof, it arrives. We want things fast and quick and right now. But that kind of thinking really isn't practical when it comes to broken bones or broken hearts. We all, those of us who've experienced either of those, know that the process of healing and restoration is slow. Listen, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay. You can be both. And the challenge for us is that we live in a culture where everything we ask for comes so quickly that when we actually take time to talk to God and to pray and something doesn't happen right away, we think God abandoned us, or God didn't hear us, or God didn't care about us. Or maybe there's not really a God out there to begin with. And so we find ourselves asking the same questions that Habakkuk was asking. Habakkuk was asking. I can never remember which way to pronounce it. The same questions. God, why aren't you answering my prayer? God, why are you allowing the suffering to continue? Don't you see the weeds that are growing, God? And like Habakkuk, I struggle with those questions too. Well, there was a man named Paul. He was a strong and faithful Christian. He wrote most of the books of what we today call the New Testament, and he talked about this thing that he called a thorn in his side. And he kept trying to weed it out. He asked God 3 times to take it away, and God never took it away. And Paul recognized that after God didn't take it away, he recognized what that thing was doing for him. That there was actually a benefit that he was getting from having that thorn in his side. See, you may have asked God to take something away in your life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if he doesn't do it, then can you just leave it alone? You can leave it alone. You know why? Because the presence of the weeds does not cancel out the power of the wheat. Let me say that again. The presence of the weeds does not cancel out the power of the wheat. What is supposed to grow will grow. And so when that weed pops up and you can't get rid of it, leave it alone for a while. Let it grow for a while and see what it becomes. Because you never know that weed that you think is a weed might actually bear fruit. Because here's the thing, sometimes you and I, we can't tell the difference between the weeds and the wheat. See, here's an interesting thing that people back then, the people Jesus was talking to, would have understood, but that you and I here in 2023, for us who are here in South San Francisco, in the Bay Area, we have no understanding of this at all because this is where we live and this is the time that we live in. So we just don't get it. But the weed that Jesus was talking about is a weed that is called the darnel. This is a weed that grows in other places, but it grows in that part of the world. And the problem with the darnel, this weed that likes to grow among the wheat, is that the darnel looks like wheat. Here's a picture of it. You know, I actually should have gotten a picture of wheat too so you can see, but the darnel weed and wheat look very, very similar to each other. And they grow up just like wheat. And the roots of the darnel weed get tangled up in the roots of the wheat. That's why if you try to pull out the weeds, the darnel, you'll also end up pulling out the wheat. And at first glance, the weeds and the wheat look the same. You can't tell the difference. But here's the thing. As the wheat comes close to being ready for harvest, the wheat kernels in the wheat weigh the wheat branches down. And so they start to bend. As they're getting ready for harvest, they bend. But the weed, the darnel, doesn't have wheat kernels, so it continues to grow straight up. Do you see that as you get closer to the time of harvest, you can begin to tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds? You know now which is the wheat and the weeds. It's not really clear which is wheat and which is weeds until you're ready for the harvest. And so it makes sense that Jesus ends this parable saying, "Then I will tell the harvesters to sort out the weeds, to tie them into bundles and burn them, and to put the wheat in the barn." Because it's not until the wheat is ready that you can see which was wheat and which was weeds. You see that failure, that disappointment that some of you are processing right now? You know, that business that you started, the relationship that you're trying to save, the sickness that you're trying to get well from, the thing that you think is a weed in your life, it just might be wheat, but you don't recognize it. Or it may be a weed, but Jesus is getting ready to use it to make the wheat in your life grow. See, when you and I, when we search for meaning in the middle of our pain and suffering, we often find frustration and disappointment. But when we search for God in the middle of our pain and suffering, who we find is Jesus. Jesus who knows what it's like to endure pain and suffering. Jesus who on the night before he was arrested was up all night, couldn't sleep because of the stress and the anxiety. He was so stressed that he was actually sweating blood. That he spent the night begging his Father to save him from having to do what was about to, or to go through what was about to happen to him. Jesus wanted to escape it. He didn't want to go through it. And on the cross, he cried out in despair. He felt abandoned. He felt alone. He felt like a lot of us feel sometimes. See, Jesus knows firsthand about despair, about pain and suffering, about loneliness and grief and rejection. He knows firsthand what that feels like. But you see, Jesus didn't numb himself to it. Jesus didn't pretend that it didn't exist. Jesus didn't just smile and say, oh, well, everything happens for a reason. Instead, we see that Jesus understands our pain. And he can identify with our suffering because he experienced that suffering. And while his suffering and everything he went through doesn't answer the question of why does God allow pain and suffering, it does tell us what the answer isn't, right? The answer isn't that he doesn't care about us. The answer isn't that he doesn't love us. Again, Tim Keller, he wrote this. Listen to this. This is so great. Tim Keller writes this. He says, it can't be that God is indifferent or detached from our condition. God takes our misery and suffering so seriously that he was willing to take it on himself. He was willing to take it on himself. When Habakkuk looked around at all of the pain and suffering around him, he came to the conclusion that the only way to face it was with God. This is how he concludes his thoughts on that. He says, look at the proud. They trust in themselves and their lives are crooked. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. See, Habakkuk isn't saying that we should celebrate when we see the weeds, when we experience the weeds. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that we should learn to celebrate the wheat even when we are looking right at the weeds. So when we are faced with pain and suffering, which is inevitable, most of us have experienced it. Some of us are experiencing it right now. Every one of us is going to experience it. But when we're in the middle of it, we have a choice to make. We can lament today, or we can look forward to tomorrow. We can remain bitter, or we can seek to do better. In other words, we can sit back and we can say, God, why me? Or we can look forward and lean in and say, okay, God, what now? What are we going to do now? Those of us who have come to the conclusion that God is real and who have already made the decision to place our faith and trust in him, we still go through the bad days. We still experience the tough times. We still experience pain and suffering. But we go through them with the certainty of God's perfect power, his perfect timing, his perfect purpose, and his perfect love for you and me. That's what keeps us moving forward.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.